He left that place and went to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue. And many who heard him were astounded. They said, where did this man get all this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter? Isn't this the son of Mary and brother of James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? And are not his sisters with us? And they took offense at him. Then Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and among his own kin and in his own house." And he could do no deed of power there except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. And he was amazed at their unbelief. Then he went about among the villages teaching.
Jesus went about the villages teaching. He called the 12 disciples and began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over unclean spirits. He ordered them to take nothing for their journey except a walking stick, no bread, no bag, and no money in their belts. Jesus told the disciples to wear sandals and take only one coat. He said to them, "Be a guest in only one home. And if the people of the village won't welcome you and refuse to hear you, then shake the dust from your feet as you leave as a sign against them." And the disciples went out and proclaimed that all should repent. They cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and healed them.
When King Herod heard of it because Jesus' name was known to many. Some were saying, "John the Baptizer has been raised from the dead, and it is because of this these powers are at work in them." Others were saying, "It's Elijah." While others said, "It is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old." But when King Herod heard it, he said, "John, whom I beheaded, has been raised from the dead." For it was Herod who had sent men to arrest John. They bound him and threw him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. For Herod had married her, while John had been telling him it is unlawful for him to take his brother's wife. And Herodias held a grudge against John and wanted to kill him. But she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he protected him. Whenever he heard him speak, he was greatly puzzled. Yet he liked to listen to him. But the opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a great banquet for his courtiers, his officials, and the leading men of Galilee. When Herodias' daughter came in and danced for the guests and for Herod, she pleased them. And Herod said to her, ask me whatever you want, and I will give it you. And he solemnly swore to her, whatever you ask, I will give it. Why, even half my kingdom? Well, she went out to her mother and asked her, what shall I ask? And she said, the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Immediately the girl rushed back to the king and requested, I want the head of John the Baptist on a platter. The king was deeply grieved. And yet in regard for his guests and the oaths he had sworn, he did not want to refuse her. And so he sent a soldier of the guard to the prison to bring back John's head. And the soldier beheaded John and then brought on a platter the head of John the Baptist and gave it to the girl. And the girl gave it to her mother. When John's disciples heard of it, they came and they took his body and they laid it in a tomb.
The disciples gathered around Jesus and told him all the things that they had done and taught. Then, because there were so many people coming and going, that Jesus and his disciples didn't even have a chance to eat, Jesus said to them, "Come away with me to a quiet place by yourselves and have a rest." And so they went in a boat by themselves to a quiet place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. So when Jesus landed, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, for they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. By that time, it was already late in the day. And so his disciples came to Jesus, and they said, "This is a remote place, and the hour is already late. Send these people away, that they might go into the surrounding countryside and the villages, and buy food for themselves to eat." And Jesus said, You give them something to eat." His disciples replied, "That would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to spend that much buying bread for these people?" And Jesus said, "How much bread do you have? Go and see." Well, after they had found out, they came to him and they said, 5 loaves and 2 fish. And Jesus directed his disciples to have the people sit down on the green grass in groups. And so they sat in groups of 50 and 100. And Jesus took the bread, the 5 loaves, and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks to God. And then he broke the 5 loaves. And gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also took the fish and broke it and gave it to all. And everyone ate and was satisfied. And after, the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of pieces of bread and fish. And the number of men who ate that day was 5,000.
Immediately, he made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After saying farewell to them, he went up on the mountain to pray. When evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. When he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came toward them early in the morning, walking on the sea. When they saw him walking on, he intended to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and they cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. Immediately, he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Don't be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. They were utterly astonished, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened.
When they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret, and they moored the boat there. When they got out of the boat, the people at once recognized Jesus, and they rushed through the whole countryside, and they began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he was, in villages or cities or farms, they brought him the sick, and they laid them in the marketplaces. And they begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak. And whoever touched it was healed.
Now, when the Pharisees and some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus, they noticed that some of his disciples were eating with defiled hands, that is, without washing them. For the Pharisees and all the Judeans do not eat unless they thoroughly wash their hands, and thus observing the tradition of the elders. And they do not eat anything from the market unless they wash it. Oh, and there are many other traditions that they also observe. The washing of cups and pots. Oh, and bronze kettles. So the Pharisees and scribes asked Jesus, why? Why do your disciples not live according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? And Jesus answered them. And he said, Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites, for it is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold on to human tradition. And then Jesus again called the crowd. And he said to them, listen to me, all of you, and understand there is nothing that by going in a person can defile, but what comes out is what defiles. For it is from within. It is from within the human heart that evil intentions come. Pornography, theft, murder, adultery, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, envy, pride, slander, folly. All these things come from within. And it is these evil things that defile a person. So then Jesus went to the region of Tyre. He entered a house, but did not want anybody to know he was there. But he could not escape notice. Of course not. So a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him. And she came to Jesus and she bowed at his feet. Now, the woman was a Gentile of Syrophoenician origin. Just saying. And she begged Jesus to cast the demon out of her daughter. You know what Jesus said? Jesus said to her, let the children be fed first. For it is not fair to take the children's crumbs and throw it to the dogs. And she answered him. And she said, but Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. And then Jesus looked at her and he said, Wow. For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. She got up. She went to her home, found the child lying in the bed, and the demon gone. So then, Jesus returned from the region of Tyre. He went by way of Sidon towards the Sea of Galilee through the region of Decapolis. And some people brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech. And they begged Jesus to lay his hands on him. So Jesus took him away in private, away from the crowd. And he put his fingers in the man's ears, he spat, and touched his tongue. And then, looking up to heaven, Jesus sighed and he said, Ephphatha, Ephphatha. That is, be opened. And immediately, the man's ears were opened. His tongue was released, and he could speak plainly. Now, of course, Jesus ordered them to say nothing about this to anyone. But the more he ordered it, the more zealously they proclaimed it, because they were astounded beyond measure. And they said, wow! Oh, whoa! This man does everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak. Wow!
In those days, there was again a great crowd without anything to eat. Jesus called his disciples and said to them, I have compassion for the crowd because they've been with me now for 3 days and they have nothing to eat. If I send them away hungry to their homes, they'll faint on the way, and many of them have come a great distance. His disciples said to him, how can anyone feed these people with bread here in the desert? Jesus asked them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. Then he ordered the people to sit down on the ground. And he took the 7 loaves, and after giving thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples to distribute, and they distributed them. There was also a few small fish, and after blessing them, he ordered that these too should be distributed. They ate and were filled. Afterwards, they picked up the broken pieces left over, 7 baskets full. Now, there was about 4,000 people there. Then Jesus sent them away.
Pharisees came up to him and they demanded that they have a sign from heaven. They were testing him. Jesus sighed deeply in his spirit. He said, why does this generation want a sign? I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation. And he left them, went back to the boat to go to the other side. But you know, they'd forgotten to buy bread. There was just 1 loaf on the boat. And Jesus cautioned them. He said, just beware of the leaven of Herod. and the leaven of the Pharisees. But they all talked among themselves, and they kept saying, "But we have no bread, we have no bread." And he said, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Have you no perception? Have you not seen? And do you not remember? When I fed the 4,000 with 5 loaves, how many baskets of bits and pieces did you pick up afterwards?" And they said to him, 7. And he said, "And when I fed the 5,000 with 7 loaves, how many baskets did you pick up afterwards?" And they said, 12. And he said, "Still you don't understand?" And so they came to Bethsaida, and they brought to him a blind man in the hopes that he would touch him. But Jesus took the blind man by the hand, and he led him away from the village. And there he spat and spat upon his eyes, and laid his hands upon him, and said to him, "Can you see anything?" And he said, "I see men. But they look like trees walking." And again Jesus laid his hands on him, and he peered intently, and he saw clearly. And Jesus sent him away to his home, but he said, "Just don't go near the village."
Jesus went on with his disciples towards the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they said, "John the Baptist. Some say you're Elijah, others one of the prophets." And Jesus said, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered him, and he said, "You're the Messiah." And Jesus sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him.
And he began to teach them, telling them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But Jesus, turning and looking at his disciples, rebuked Peter. "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." And he gathered the crowd and his disciples to him, and he began to tell them, "Any who wish to follow me, let them deny themselves and pick up their cross and follow me. For those who would save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake, or for the sake of the gospel, will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this sinful and adulterous generation, of them will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angel.
6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, and he led them up a high mountain where they were apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Moses and Elijah, and they were talking with Jesus. And Peter said, "Rabbi, it's good for us to be here. Let's make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." He didn't know what to say because they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice. "This is my son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, there was no one with them except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man was risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead could mean. Then they asked him, "Why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" Jesus said to them, "Elijah is indeed coming first to restore all things. How then is it written about the Son of Man that he has to undergo great sufferings and be treated with contempt? Truly I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did to him whatever they pleased, as it is written about him." When they came to the disciples, they saw a large crowd gathered around them, and the scribes arguing with them. When the whole crowd saw Jesus, they were immediately overcome with awe, and they ran forward to greet him. Jesus said to them, "What are you arguing about with them?" And someone from the crowd said, "Teacher, I brought you my son. He has a spirit that makes him unable to speak and hear. And when it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and goes rigid. I asked your disciples to cast it out, but they couldn't do it." Jesus said to them, "You faithless generation, how much longer must I be with you? How much longer must I put up with you? Bring him to me." And they brought him to him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately convulsed the boy, and he fell down and rolled around and foamed at the mouth. Jesus asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "Since childhood. It's often seized him and thrown him into the fire or into the water to destroy him. If you can do anything for him, have pity on us and help us." Jesus said to him, "If you can, all things can be done for the one who believes." And the father cried out, "I believe, help my unbelief." When Jesus saw that a crowd was coming running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying, "You spirit that keep this boy from speaking and hearing, come out of him at once and never enter him again." And with a great cry and a terrible convulsion, the spirit left the boy. And the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, "He's dead." But Jesus bent down and took him by the hands, and he was able to stand. Later, when they were in the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we cast it out?" Jesus said to them, "This kind can only be cast out with prayer."
They went on from there, and they passed through Galilee. But he did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples and saying to them, "The Son of Man will be betrayed by the hands of the people. They will kill him. And after he has been killed, 3 days later, he will rise again. But they did not understand what he was telling them and was afraid to ask him.
Jesus and the disciples were visiting Capernaum. And when they had lodged there, Jesus said to them, "What were you discussing on the way here?" But they were silent, because they had been arguing about which one of them was the greatest. So Jesus called the 12 together, and he said to them, "Whoever would be the greatest must be the least of all and the servant of all." And he brought a small child in amongst them, and he picked up the child in his arms, and he said, "Whoever welcomes such a child as this in my name welcomes me. And whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." The disciple John said to Jesus, "Teacher, we saw a man casting out demons in your name, and we told him to stop because he's not one of us." But Jesus said, "Do not tell him to stop, for whoever does such a great work like this in my name cannot speak evil of me soon afterward. Indeed, whoever is not against us is for us. And whoever offers you a cup of water because you bear the name of Christ will not lose their reward." Jesus said, "Whoever causes the least of those who believe in me to stumble, it would be better that they had a giant millstone tied around their neck and be thrown into the sea. If your hand causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better to go to heaven maimed than to enter hell with 2 hands where the fire is never quenched. And if your foot causes you to stumble, cut it off. It is better to enter heaven lame than to be thrown into hell with 2 feet. And if your eye causes you to stumble, pluck it out. It is better to go to heaven with 1 eye than to enter hell with 2 eyes and be where the fire is never quenched and the worm never dies. For everyone will be salted with fire, but the sacrifice, that will be salted with salt. And if salt loses its saltiness, it can no longer be used for seasoning. Therefore, have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another."